All right, everybody. Hello, welcome back. So this is part 3 of your week 1 lesson. So what we're going to do now is finish up the chapter 1 material, and then we'll start into the chapter 2 material. So where we left off in part 2 was looking at the core values of community psychology, and we were talking about citizen participation. So this is a core value of community psychology that is all about helping people participate in decision-making processes that affect them so that they feel as though they have a meaningful say in things that impact their lives. This goes hand in hand with empowerment, right? So really important stuff that we try to do in community psychology, again, very closely related to our history, where we've come from with that civil rights movement connection. All right. And the last value here that we're going to talk about is collaboration and community strengths. So what we try to do in community psychology is collaborate with one another. So this is about meaningful empowerment, participation, and what we try to do in community psychology is acknowledge that people's lived experiences are extremely valuable and that people are the experts of their own lives and experiences. And so I'll tell a little story, and this will hopefully help explain how collaboration and acknowledging community strengths is an important value for us to have in community psychology. But one of the things that sometimes happens when expert groups or consultants, for example, are hired to come into a community and address an issue is the members of the community will say, well, you don't really know what our problem is. You don't really know what our experience is. You haven't lived here. You're just some expert. You're a consultant. You don't know what it means to be a member of this community, etc. So what we try to do in community psychology is, a lot of community psychologists do have roles as consultants. They do go into communities to try to address real social issues. But instead of going into a community and saying, okay, well, I'm the psychologist and I'm going to help you with your problems, that kind of thing, we go in and we say, okay, you guys tell us, right? You tell us what the problem is. You teach us. And based on that, we're going to use our knowledge as psychologists, as researchers, and we're going to try to implement some sort of intervention or program or service, resource, whatever it is that we're trying to do to help. But we do that through collaboration and through acknowledging that even if a community is going through something difficult, there still are some major strengths within that community. So we try to harness those strengths, work from what we would call a strengths-based perspective, and collaborate with community members and help that way. And sorry, I spoke too soon. We have one more value, I believe. Yes. So, which is empirical grounding. So what we try to do in community psychology is make sure that everything we do is grounded in very good research. We never want to implement a program to deal with an issue. We never want to, put resources or money or time into a service without first being confident that it will work, right? And so what we try to do to the best of our ability is use all of the research skills that we have under our belt to gather as much information as possible to say, okay, I'm going into X community that is struggling with high levels of homelessness. What are we going to do? Okay, well, I'm going to go to the books. I'm going to go to all of my online resources. I'm going to talk to my colleagues. I'm going to maybe do a pilot study, for example, to try to see if I can understand what will help my program be the most successful as possible in the community that I'm hoping to achieve this or roll out this program into. Basically, what we want to do is make sure that our community action is effective and valid, right? We never want to waste people's time. We never want to waste people's money. And so we try to make sure that everything we do is grounded in research. And that is why, my friends, we're going to be spending next week talking about research. Research methods is not often everyone's favorite topic. Super important though, and we're going to be looking at research through a bit of a case study approach. So hopefully it won't be as dry as maybe some of your other experiences with research methods. All right, so we have a few key concepts to review here from Chapter 1. So we started off Chapter 1 looking at definitions of psychology, community, and community psychology. We talked about the difference between first and second order change. We examined the ecological levels of analysis, very important for community psychology. And we also talked about our core values in community psychology. So, my friends, very important stuff. You are now indoctrinated. You have been introduced to community psychology. Let's jump into Chapter 2 of your textbook, which looks at community psychology history. So, you've heard me say that, community psychology was really a development that came out of the civil rights movement in the 1960s in the United States. Basically, what we had was a group of psychologists coming together, and these were psychologists who were trained in areas like clinical psychology. So clinical psychology is often the picture of a psychologist that often comes to people's minds when you hear of or when you think of what a psychologist is. A clinical psychologist is someone who would sit down, do face-to-face therapy with people, that kind of thing. So what we saw in the 1960s was there was this group of psychologists who just didn't feel like something was right? They believed that they needed to develop a new field. And community psychology, basically what it is it's a reaction to the limitations of mainstream psychology and then an extension of it. So what these community psychologists at the time, what they really thought was happening that they weren't happy with mainstream psychology was they said, okay, well, why are we waiting for people to get sick? Why are we waiting for somebody to develop depression and then treating it? Why aren't we preventing people from getting depressed in the first place, right? Why aren't we putting resources and services into communities to help people who need help rather than just waiting for them to develop anxiety issues or depression or other serious mental health issues? So community psychologists, when they were developing the field, they sought to take a more preventative approach, and they sought to go beyond that individual level that we talked about. They thought that mainstream psychology was focusing way too much on that individual level, on individual explanations for why people were experiencing mental health issues, rather than taking a little bit more critical or ecological understanding. So let's take a little bit of, a bit more specific look at some of this history. Again, we're looking post-World War II, right? So post-World War II, this is the late 40s, early 1950s. What was happening was that societies were changing based on everything that the world had gone through in World War II. World War II was a terrible, terrible thing, right? And so what we see is that people are increasing their social tolerance. Things like government aid are becoming much more prevalent in different societies. And then, of course, we have that civil rights movement and lots of social reform happening in the 1960s. So there were a number of factors that did specifically impact the development of community psychology. And again, each one of these factors here gets its own slide. So I'm just going to jump right into the next one. So factor one, taking a preventative perspective. You've heard me talk about this a couple times already. So community psychologists, when they were developing the field, they were quite dissatisfied with what we call the medical model. Now, traditional psychology has been accused, or sometimes is a little bit, what's the word? Reliant on what we would call medical model practices, that we wait for somebody to quote unquote get sick with a mental illness and then we treat them. So what this group of psychologists wanted to do was prevent people from getting sick at all. And they also were thinking, all of these people who are developing depression, anxiety, serious mental illnesses, we can't just rely on this one-to-one professional patient to psychologist model for treating people like we treat physical illnesses. So we want to adopt this kind of public health prevention model. Again, this is post-World War II. There were a lot of reforms happening in mental health. A lot of people were coming home from World War II with symptoms of what I'm sure people are very much more familiar with now, symptoms of a terrible psychological issue called post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. At the time, they were referred to as being, kind of shell-shocked is one of the terms that was used post-World War II. So these soldiers were coming home having seen horrific, horrible, terrible things, and they needed help. They needed help immediately. So there were a lot of reforms that happened at the time in mental health to support this huge group of people that needed help. And one of these supports was the deinstitutionalization movement, supporting people with mental health issues in their homes rather than removing them from the home, putting them into an institutional facility, a residential institutional facility, and treating them there. We do still have psychiatric institutions in our society, but they are mostly used only for the most extreme cases of folks who are struggling with issues, who are either at risk of harming themselves, harming others, who need kind of round-the-clock care, that kind of thing. These are not nice places. We do not want people to have to go to a psychiatric institution unless they really, really have to. And most people, we learned at this time, can be successfully treated from home. Good, better. This fellow right here, George Albee, he was responsible for a lot of these shifts in how we thought about mental health. He basically was a huge proponent of prevention, and he was one of these folks who was just harping on the fact that there were never going to be enough psychologists to treat all of these people. So if we could prevent people from developing mental illnesses in the first place, yeah, let's do that. Action research, factor number 3. This fellow right here, Kurt Lewin, he was the one that really got us thinking about the importance of research and using research to inform how we went about creating social action. So, studying group dynamics, how that could be used to address social community problems, etc. Now, social change and liberation is another big aspect of what was happening, another factor that impacted essentially our approach to developing this field, what was going on. And I want to spend a little bit more time on this because it's very, very important. So I'm going to stop the video here and start our 4th part for your week 1 material on chapter 2. So stay tuned for part 4. It's coming next, and you're doing really good work, guys. Awesome. See you soon.